Food prices rose sharply in 2021. The UN says they were the highest in a decade and warned there are no guarantees they'll fall this year. But what's behind this spike? And what will it take to bring prices down? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vinell. For many, 2021 offered hope of some return to normality. But as countries pushed to reopen after months of lockdowns and tightly controlled borders, economists began to warn of a new looming crisis: the rising cost of food. The UN Food Agency says prices jumped 28% during the year, reaching their highest level since 2011. In December, they eased slightly, but before that had been climbing for 4 months in a row. The surge is being blamed on a number of factors, including supply chain bottlenecks and increased costs for raw materials and energy. Higher food prices contribute to higher inflation, which affects consumers around the world. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization tracks prices. It found that all categories showed sharp increases in 2021. Crucial food staples like maize and wheat surged by at least a third. The cost of vegetable oil hit an all-time high, more than 65% up on 2020. And sugar cost more than it has in 5 years. The UN warns the situation shows no sign of improving this year and could force dramatic changes in the way people eat. As always, poorer nations are disproportionately affected, especially those reliant on imports. The UN says the region most at risk of famine and food insecurity is sub-Saharan Africa, with the situation getting out of control in places like Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, South Sudan and Central African Republic. In Afghanistan, more than half the population is expected to face life-threatening hunger this winter. Food prices there have soared. Urgent aid is needed to save next year's harvest. And in Latin America, the pandemic has pushed countries like Venezuela and Peru even further into food insecurity, with significant increases in poverty and hunger. Let's now bring in our guests. Joining us from Cape Town is Jane Battersby, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town. In Rome, Abdolreza Abbassian, Senior Economist at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And on Skype from New Delhi is Deepa Sinha. She is Professor of Economics at Ambedkar University, Delhi. A very warm welcome to each of you. Thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. I'd like to begin with you, Abdolreza Abbassian. Just explain to our viewers, what is it that has driven food prices so high?
Well, as you very nicely, I guess, summarized it, when we talk about food prices, the FAO one, it's a measure of international prices going up in international markets, and it's composed of many commodities, each of them for different reasons. So it's very hard to say this is the reason for all of them. Meat went up for one reason, cereals for another, and so forth. The increase in prices started, in fact, I would say, during the last quarter in 2020. And then it continued continuously all the way to now. Yes, there was a little decline, as you also mentioned, in December. There was also a little bit of a decline in June and July. So except those 2 to 3 months, you had every month going up. If I were to generalize, I would have said that the demand surprised us. The strong demand for at the world level, despite health issues, despite COVID and all the expectations that perhaps countries would be importing less and so forth, it didn't really materialize. So demand continued strong. And on the supply side, we had few problems here and there, especially for crops such as wheat, let's say, where production shortfalls in some of the major exporting countries were to blame, but also there were, as you mentioned, a bit of the logistical issues. A combination of factors came together on the supply side that made the supply and demand situation tight for almost all the 4 or 5 category of commodities that we compile. Now, the issue is that it's been continuous, it's been going up. Yes, in December there was a little decline, but you would have expected that usually before big festivities, there is a bit of a pressure down on demand at the world level. But the whole situation does remain a bit precarious and I would say worrying.
Okay, let's cross over to Jane Battersby in Cape Town. Jane, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, as we discussed earlier, is one of the places most at risk of food insecurity. What impact are these high prices having there?
Yeah, so much of Africa was already in crisis before these food price increases. So we know that the FAO estimated that about a fifth of Africa's population already go hungry, and that 3/4 are unable to afford a nutritionally adequate diet. And so when you compound the impact of those food price increases, we see the deleterious effect. And obviously a lot of the focus is on those kind of conflict-affected countries like South Sudan, like Central African Republic, and we see critical food insecurity there. So for example, in South Sudan, it's estimated that about 70% of the population will need food relief. However, I think we maybe get too caught up in those conflict-affected countries and fail to recognize the magnitude of the crisis across the continent as a whole. And many households are kind of on the cusp of being severely food insecure, and these food price increases will push them into that next crisis.
Before we move on and cross over to New Delhi, I just want to ask you for our viewers, because often we can use jargon and we forget that not everybody uses this jargon. What do we mean by food insecure?
Sure. So food insecure is different to hunger. So food insecure is really the uncertainty about where your food is going to come from, about being unable to access an adequate diet. So often it extends beyond kind of base hunger and really into that challenge of getting a nutritious diet, of knowing where your food is going to come from and having kind of reliability of supply. And so we think about food insecurity as being based on, is there food available? Are you able to access it physically, economically, or socially? Are you able to utilize the food that you get? And is that system stable? Recently, the FAO has also added on another 2 dimensions about agency. So what kind of power do you have in that system? And how sustainable is the food system that's providing for you?
Okay, let's go over to New Delhi. Deepa Sinha, what impact are these higher food prices having in India? And what was the situation like before 2021?
Right. So 2 things here. Firstly, when we talk about the impact of inflation, India is in a slightly different space because we don't see very high food inflation here yet as far as staples are concerned, which is also because the main staples, rice and wheat, India's food is self-sufficient in terms of production. So we don't depend on imports, and the production of these crops have not been affected in the COVID years either. But for foods such as pulses and oils, India has also seen very high inflation over the last many months. And these are crucial components of diets in India, pulses being the main source of protein and edible oils being the main source of fat in Indian diets. And we see a change in people's diets where they're not able to consume enough of these foods. And this needs to be seen in the context of overall food insecurity and malnutrition in India, even before 2021. For long, we know that although India has seen high levels of economic growth, in terms of malnutrition, we've not made much progress. And there's some data which suggests that 2/3 of Indian population could not afford a balanced diet before COVID began. And post the pandemic, because of the lockdowns and the economic slowdown, we again have a lot of evidence showing that the situation is worse, where many more people have fallen below the poverty line and are what you would define as being food insecure, even if not it's sleeping hungry, but not getting an adequate diet.
Abdolreza, Abbassian, you mentioned demand and supply as sort of generalizing, but 2 of the big issues at play. I was interested to read about the role of energy prices and fertilizer, because as governments spend money and energy prices go up, I mean, what impact is that going to have as we go ahead into 2022?
Yes, well, this is in fact the concern that we think the international community surely will have to keep in mind for the months ahead, because usually in agriculture you do get high prices, for one reason or another. But agriculture is quite a strong sector. It responds. Farmers go and invest. High prices is maybe bad for consumers, not bad for producers. And farmers definitely would try to make the best out of it. But this assumes that the cost of production is not going to go up as much or even exceed, in which case there isn't much in terms of investing and increasing production. And this is always a danger. It doesn't happen often. It probably happens very rarely, in fact. And this time around, we are confronted with a situation where fertilizer prices are basically skyrocketed. And for many parts of the world, farmers would say, wait a second, I'm just not going to put that fertilizer on the ground because it's just going to cost me so much, and my profit margin will shrink. So it's not really a done deal that we're going to get that sort of a response that we would normally get in terms of increasing production. And this comes right at the time when we know climatic conditions and extreme weather conditions at wrong time can really, really destroy, let's say, the prospects, basically all the way up right to the day before the harvest, let's say. So it is a worrying situation when prices high, supplies barely adequate, and having this uncertainty about production. Now, fertilizers being high, part of it is actually also energy prices. Actually, most of it is because of the energy prices and the gas prices and what happened to it. And this is just one aspect where energy comes into play, let's say, with the prospects that we are considering now. But there are also a lot of other aspects. As any other industry, the dependence on energy is huge, not to mention also for the transport and so forth. And then there is, and as we know now, for more than a decade now, a alternative energy away from the fossil fuel has definitely encouraged a bigger production of, let's say, ethanol and biodiesel and so forth from corn and from other agriculture crops as feedstock for production of biofuels. And that usually happens that demand gets stronger and stronger the higher the energy prices go, which means that you also have that distraction, let's say, on the demand side. We seem to be getting all of it now. I don't want to draw a very dark picture about this whole thing. There is still time. We don't know exactly how the production situation is going to evolve. It's just too early at this time of the year to be too negative. But I think we need to be more careful than we usually are at this time of the year, because we are starting it after like 14 months of increasing prices. And the food inflation that you mentioned basically persists in many countries, on top of inflationary pressures coming from basically all sides because of the COVID and other reasons.
Okay, I want to pick up on something you said and cross over to Jane Battersby, just mentioning there weather and climate change. What impact, if any, has weather and climate change had on what we're seeing now in terms of the skyrocketing food prices?
It's had impacts across the board. We're often trying to think about an individual country and its climate dimensions. And so, in South Africa, we've had regional droughts. We recently had a massive increase in potato prices simply because of a drought in a particular region in the country. And yet we're also experiencing the global effects. So the very high oil prices, food oil prices we've experienced are as a result of drought in the Black Sea area. And so we need to think about how a globalized food system is resilient and vulnerable to these climate shocks. And so I think one of the questions we need to think about then is, how do we make the system more resilient to these ongoing shocks that are going to become increasingly present in our food systems and indeed our daily lives?
Okay, Deepa Sinha, I want to ask you about China. One analyst posited another potential reason for the rising prices: China's hoarding supplies. The US Department of Agriculture saying China is expected to have 69% of the entire world's maize reserves in the first half of the crop year 2022, 60% of its rice, 51% of its wheat. What's your take? Is China also to blame?
I think linking this to also what the previous speaker said, I don't know what the true picture in China is. We don't know the clear data. But what we do know from where I stay in India is that there is also the question of who controls the food systems, and that as we are getting into more globalized food systems, we are vulnerable to all these kinds of shocks of a certain country making certain kinds of decisions, or climate change in one part of the world affecting the whole world, oil prices going up and so on. So I think all of this actually, and the experience of food insecurity over the last 2 years in COVID, what it really points us to is to ask rather questions on how do we move towards more decentralized food systems. Like I was saying, in the context of India, inflation is in those crops which we import, crops which we had a self-sufficiency in about 30 years back, pulses and oils, for example. Similarly, in the case of rice and wheat, because we have enough, it really doesn't affect India what is happening in other countries. So I would say, rather than pointing fingers, it's also time to look at a more decentralized food system, even within a country. Like in a country like India, I would say it's still very centralized at the national level, something that communities have control over, where farmers get remunerative prices, and at the same time that the mix of the crops that are being grown in different parts of the world is suited to the local environment and the local demand.
I know there's another example which is put forward, which is Qatar. During the blockade, Qatar moved to become much more self-sufficient in terms of its food production. I'd like to come back to you, Abdolreza, Abbassian. What initiatives are there out there right now to try and ease, I know you don't want to be too doomsday, maybe not an impending crisis, but to ease the situation that we have now? You know, as Jane was saying, you know, how do we make the food supply system more resilient?
Well, in a way, you know, we've been trusting the markets, and I must say, markets have more or less, international markets have more or less delivered on what we expected. That is, the supply adjusts to the demand and so forth. We had issues back, you may recall, 2008, 9, 10, 11, in that period. There were a lot of export restrictions. That interference in the market actually resulted in much higher prices. Rice at the time was a big issue, in fact, the restrictions on rice exports. One reason today we're talking about all these high prices, but we don't probably see as sort of a crisis in the scale we saw last time, is that, incidentally, rice is among one of the very few countries, few commodities for which prices fell in 2021 compared to 2022, I think on average about 4%. And that's why also our colleague from India was referring to inflation in India being a little bit less of an issue, is because of the quite an ample rice situation. So what I'm trying to say here is that we learned quite a bit from the last episode. And I think what we learned is that if you just go on ad hoc put export restriction measures and you're an important exporter, this bound not to only create problems at the world level, but will also actually create problem domestically eventually for your own farmers that are not going to benefit from high prices, therefore they will not respond. This very market approach has more or less worked quite well, and we hope that it could be sustained, and this could be in itself a solution. At the international level, what has been happening since the last crisis was the establishment of the Agriculture Market Information System by G20, which is also hosted here in FAO. And actually, one objective of this is that all the exporters and importers, all major ones, are part of this group. They get together once a month to discuss world. We do discuss what's happening, the statistics, numbers, and also policy. And I think this has helped us quite a bit, at least if nothing, for coordination of the policies. And I think this could be considered as one of the things that could be singled out from the international side in helping to create a more stable, predictable markets. Okay. And if I may just conclude on this, because China was mentioned, and China is part of this group that I just mentioned. There are a lot of statistics about China, but we have to be very careful. The USDA number about reserves in China was interpreted in some corner as this is China gone to the market and bought all these things and kept it, over 50% of the world reserve. But that's not what USDA meant, and that's not the real situation. These stocks in China, which today indeed represent more than 50% of the global cereal stocks, have been accumulated over a very, very long time. And those numbers are not official numbers because China does not publish them. And be it USDA, us, and other information sources, we don't have good numbers about the stocks, not just for China, but for almost no other country. So that is a reserve that has been carried over from one year to another. It doesn't mean it can all be useful or it can just be fed to people tomorrow if it needed. China's importance is its size. And this year, at the beginning of the year, we saw prices went up a lot because of big China demand, the demand for corn, the demand for soybean, and the demand for meat at the very beginning of the year because of the disease in the pig sector.
I hear what you're saying.
Those things have, yeah.
I hear what you're saying. No, this is exactly why we invite people like you on, is to get to the bottom of statistics like that, which on face value can be quite shocking. I'd like to come over to you, Jane Battersby. We've talked about, at the macro level, at the level of policy, of government, at a global level, but on a human level, when food becomes very expensive and the quality of, the cost of living is already very high, what sort of societal impact do you think we might see? I mean, we've seen protests across the world this year, or last year in 2021, over the rising cost of living. I know you can't simplify something to say, food is expensive, therefore people are protesting. But do you think we might see, an impact societally as a result of food becoming more expensive?
Oh, absolutely. So we've been doing research throughout this time period and seeing the impact of it on individuals and households, and seeing how people are changing their diets, changing their food purchasing patterns, reducing the quality of their diets, but also the impact that it has on people's psyche, the impact that it has on social networks when they become too strained. And yes, long term, we are seeing social protests that sometimes are not explicitly about food, but we believe are food-based protests. And so I think there really is an urgency to address this. But I think also part of the solution to these challenges also rests in understanding how people navigate these crises and see how people seek out these points of resilience, seek out the diversity in the system, seek out the kind of more social, less market-based systems, and seeing how to build resilience in those systems may well provide us with a buffer to some of the worst excesses of the food price crisis we're seeing at the moment.
Deepa Sinha, I know that you are a professor of economics. You're also a food security specialist. In terms of politics, though, do you think that all eyes will now be on policymakers to get the right balance, to find a way to lift economies post-pandemic, but also ensure that the cost of food doesn't go up too much?
Absolutely. So even if we look at the last time when there was this kind of global food price inflation after 2008-9, we did see what is called food riots in many parts of the world, and also other protests which were not about food, but many scholars have then linked it to the fact that inflation in food items was so high, which led to a lot of discontent among people, resulting in protests. I think now that kind of a threat, that's an even more serious concern, because given COVID, it's also a period when people have been losing jobs, incomes have been going down. And on top of that, when food prices increase, then it's bound to become a social problem as well, along with being a moral ethical issue that you have a health pandemic on the one hand, and then the other side, people are not able to feed themselves enough. So this is something that all governments will be questioned about and should be really concerned. It's unfortunate that many are still not seeing the crisis, but it is something that's staring at us.
Very quickly, we've got about 45 seconds left. It's a big question for a quick answer to you, Deepa Sinha. How do you think policymakers will respond in terms of, is this an opportunity to rethink how we do better in terms of rising prices, how we do better in terms of supply chains?
Yeah, so I do think that COVID is an opportunity for us to completely rethink our food systems rather than having piecemeal solutions. Like in India, now about 80% of the population are being given subsidized rice and wheat, but that's not enough. What we need is a more in-depth looking into the food system, why prices are so volatile, which means looking at agriculture differently. What I was saying earlier, thinking about a more decentralized food system with a variety of crops which are grown in using climate-friendly methods. I think all of this can be done. There is a lot of research and ideas on how this can be achieved.
All right.
And this might be.
Okay, we have to leave it there for time. Thank you so much for joining us. All of our guests, Jane Battersby, Abdolreza, Abbassian, and Deepa Sinha. We appreciate it. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vinell, and the whole team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.